Imagine losing your head and living to tell the tale. Or can you believe a man was pumped up like an inflatable doughboy and survived the ordeal? Could a person be chopped in half, drilled through the head, and come out the other end? These are some amazing stories you'll hear today, dark, tinted tales, fortunately adorned with bright silver linings. Many of us dream of going skydiving, but one thing none of us ever wants to experience is doing so without a parachute. It's frightening for anyone to think what those last few thoughts on your mind would be as you neared the ground. We guess there aren't many people you could ask, because people don't generally fall from massive heights and live to tell the tale. New Zealander Michael Holmes did. He fell 15,000 feet when parachuting and lived to tell the tale. He pulled his cord at around 4,000 feet. Nothing happened. He then pulled something called the cutaway cable, which he thought would release his main parachute, but that didn't happen. The reserve chute didn't open either. He was now in dire straits, flying down to the ground, which was around 2,000 feet away. If you don't count the spire and antenna, that's not much under 2 Empire State Buildings. Holmes was getting close to reaching terminal velocity of 120 miles per hour, but that was reduced to about 80 miles per hour because the chutes he tried to open slowed him with the drag. He didn't think he'd survive, and so when he was around 550 feet from the ground, he managed to wave to others who were in the sky that day. 10 seconds from impact, he screamed, "I'm dead, bye." 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bang! You hear the thud recorded by his device. Everything turned black. There was silence. A fellow parachuter who jumped that day ran over to him. Of course, he thought he was surely dead, but he couldn't believe his eyes when he saw signs of life. Okay, Holmes was a bloody and broken mess, but he was breathing. It seems Lady Luck was on his side. He would surely have died had he hit the nearby water or just about any part of the ground, but he actually landed in a 6-foot-high thicket of bramble bushes. Yeah, like straight out of a cartoon. Even though he smashed through that thicket, with them being so high, they acted as a pretty good cushion. It was just amazing that he hit them, given he could have fallen anywhere. He was knocked unconscious and he punctured his lung, his left ankle was shattered, and he was cut up badly. But considering the height he fell from, he was in good shape. Still, the guy that found him thought he would die. He said he was kind of breathing, but then his lips turned really blue, and he stopped, so I gave him a big pinch on his cheek and he came back. Holmes' own conclusion to the accident was this: "I've gone through everything that happened 1,000 times in my head. It was 1,000,000 to 1 chance. I'm prepared to stake my life on the likelihood that it will never happen again." Now for some good old gore. Like all the people we'll tell you about today, this miracle of survival isn't for the faint of heart. The man involved is named Matthew Lowe, and on the day his life changed, he was the happily married father of 1 child. In 2011, he was at work in a factory in northern England when he was dragged through a small hole in a steel processing machine. And when we say small, we mean it. It was only about 5 inches in diameter. His hand went first, and when the machine got the middle of his arm, Lowe said he heard a terrifying snapping sound. But the machine wasn't done yet, not by any means. It kept on pulling him in. He later explained what it felt like, saying, "As the machine dragged me through, I just relaxed because I knew I couldn't do anything, and I thought that was the end for me." The machine actually dragged him the whole way through and then released him, bloodied and torn at the other end. He was barely clinging to life at this point, but thanks to his quick-thinking workmates, he kept breathing long enough to get to the hospital. He later said, "In the end, it crushed my body, ripped my clothes to shreds, and literally spat me out the other end. But I was still alive. I didn't know how, but I didn't lose consciousness. I just couldn't see for a while afterwards." Doctors then worked on his many injuries, which included a shattered pelvis, his back broken in 2 spots, fractured hips and ribs, and just to make things worse, his stomach and bowel were ruptured. He could have so easily died. He should have died. In fact, when doctors went to talk to his stricken wife, they said to her, "Expect the worst." But after 2 years of rehabilitation and a bunch of metal plates placed in various parts of his body, he made a full recovery, just about. His only long-term injury is weakness in his arm. He knows how lucky he was, later telling the press, "I still don't know how I didn't die. I don't really know how I managed to survive being dragged through such a tiny gap. Luckily, my head went through a bigger gap before my body was dragged through what was a gap no wider than a CD case." As for learning something from his story, Lowe said the reason he was dragged into the machine was that part of his overalls were loose when he walked past it. The company could have also been to blame, since there should have been guards on that machine that prevented bits from biting people. The next one will make you shiver, for more than one reason. If there was a quiz and you were asked to guess the amount of time a normal person could survive at most underwater with no breathing equipment or anything else to help, what would you put down as the answer? The answer for the average person, it's usually good for about 90 seconds. Still, there are people in the world who train for such things. They might be able to last 20 minutes or so. But you, your friends, just about everyone you know, would be dead if you were underwater for just a few minutes. But not for one woman, a girl not trained in the art of holding her breath. She survived 80 minutes underwater, and for that, her story has become one of the most human-based natural wonders of the world. Her name is Anna Elisabeth Johansson Bagenholm, and she hails from Sweden. She's a much older woman now, but still people today call her the walking miracle. That's because when she was 29, she went for a plunge in some very cold water. On the 20th of May 1999, she went skiing with some friends in Norway, and they were surgeons just like she was. Things went wrong when she lost control of her skis and went flying off course. That ended with her going headfirst into a frozen stream. The impact created a big hole in the ice, and she plunged into the water. What a nightmare. Although later she said at that point she was unconscious, so she wasn't exactly scared. The ice was thick too, about 7.9 inches thick. When her pals arrived on the scene, they could see her skis and feet above the water, but the rest of her body was submerged. Rightly, the friends believed that if they didn't get her out quickly, she would die. That's what should have happened. That's what would happen to most people. They tried to pull her out, but it proved to be impossible. It wasn't until 7 minutes after impact that they called for help. Now their friend should have been dead for a few minutes. When the rescue team arrived, the two friends were still holding on to Bagenholm's skis. The rescue team used a rope to pull her out, but it didn't work. They then used a shovel to try and dig her out. That also didn't work. Finally, they removed her using another cutting tool. She'd now been in the water for 80 minutes. As expected, she wasn't breathing when she was back on solid ground. Her blood wasn't circulating and her eyes were dilated. The rescue team performed CPR on her, but there was no effect. They kept doing it in the helicopter, and then they pulled out the defibrillator, but again, nothing. When she arrived at the hospital, her body temperature was 13.7 degrees Celsius. No one in this world had ever survived having a body temp that low. The electrocardiogram reading was that of a dead person. The doctor remarked, "She has completely dilated pupils, she is ashen, flaxen white, she is wet, she is ice cold when I touch her skin, and she looks absolutely dead." She looked that way to everyone. But the doctor knew that in such cases you should never sign off on death before you've warmed the victim. So that's what he and the nurses did. They never gave up on her. With around 100 doctors and nurses working on her for almost half a day, after being hooked up to a body-warming machine at precisely 22:15, her heartbeat fluttered. It was music to everyone's ears, but then her lungs stopped functioning properly and it was looking like she was a goner again. She was put on a ventilator after that. On May 10th, 10 days after her plunge, she woke up, although she couldn't move any part of her body below her neck. When she understood what her circumstances were, she was actually upset that her friends had saved her. In her own words, she later said, "I was very irritated when I realized they had saved me. I feared a meaningless life without any dignity." After another 2 months in intensive care, she was flown back to Sweden where she recovered some more. Unbelievably, there was no permanent brain damage even though her brain had been starved of oxygen for so long. Almost half a year later, she went back to the hospital in Norway to thank everyone. Her only injuries were some nerve damage to her hands and feet. Okay, so what you want to know is, how did this woman cheat death? She really should have died, hence she's called a medical miracle. In the water, she managed to find an air pocket and somehow stay conscious. Still, how come she wasn't brain dead? How come she got through that nasty bout of hypothermia? Doctors now believe that the freezing cold helped her. You see, before her heart stopped, she'd had a fair bit of time to get really cold. Remember that your heart can stop, but to be dead, you need to be brain dead. She should have been brain dead because her brain was so cold when her heart stopped, it required little oxygen. That meant it could keep functioning, a bit like your phone can when you've turned on battery saver mode. It was a one-off, of course, and she knew that very well. She later told the media, "When you're a patient, you're not thinking you're going to die. You think, I'm going to make it. But as a medical person, I think it's amazing I'm still alive." This next one is right out of some absurd horror movie. Can you imagine if someone pumped you up, like somehow used a powerful air pump to inflate your body? Crazily enough, it happened in 2011 to a man named Stephen McCormick. We kid you not. He later told the media, "In a matter of minutes, my body blew to twice its size." It's a pity no video exists because that'd be crazy to see. But how does a man get himself blown up? It happened on the job when he was working as a truck driver in a small town in New Zealand. He was standing between his truck and trailer as his truck was connected to the very powerful compressed air supply. And that's when he slipped. And no kidding, he fell on the valve, which then penetrated his butt. The air rushing in at 100 pounds per square inch started to inflate him. It might sound amusing, but being pumped up is apparently very, very painful. McCormick was screaming in agony as his body grew, shouting at his friends to try and stop the inflation. When the paramedics arrived, he was still looking like the Michelin Man. Later telling the press, "I was blowing up like a football. I had no choice but to just lie there, blowing up like a balloon." But those paramedics had a problem. They couldn't just stick any needles into him for pain relief because his pumped-up body just spat the needle out. They couldn't even strap oxygen apparatus to his nostrils. The man was rock solid. His chest was full, his abdomen was bursting, his muscles and fat were separating. Air had filled his lungs and heart, and even his eyelids were blown up. He should have died for sure. One thing that did save him was the fact that he got pumped in the butt. If the air was pumped anywhere else, it would have meant certain death. A doctor later told the BBC it's fair to say he's lucky to be alive. It was potentially a life-threatening situation. At the hospital, they tried their best to use a hose to get the air out of his lungs, but that wasn't good enough. Another amusing part of this tale is that he had to fart a lot of the air out. And by God did he let them rip. It took 3 days of intense farting for him to return to his normal size. But man, it was such a relief to not feel like the doughboy again. He actually recovered quite quickly after that, laughing with the media when he said, "I really feel like the Michelin Man." His mates at work apparently had the time of their lives making jokes about him once he'd recovered. Now for something a bit bloodier and something that could happen to any of us. Ron Hunt has been called the Miracle Man, and for good reason. What happened to him should have taken him out. In 2003, he was working in California and he slipped on a ladder. As he tumbled to the ground, he did the right thing and threw his equipment to the side. That equipment was a drill and it had an 18-inch drill bit in it. As luck would have it, when he hit the floor head first, the drill was facing upward. So that long spike went right through his eye and came out the back of his skull. He later told the media, "I ran my hands up the drill bit up to my eye and put my other hand in the back of my head and felt it coming through the back of my head. And that's where pretty much the shock set in." He basically drilled right through his skull, which is something that should kill a person, or at least do so much damage to their brain that they wouldn't be telling the media about it later. His coworker said, "I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing." They rushed him to the hospital with the drill sticking out through his head. And once there, the doctors were in a bit of a quandary as to how to take it out without causing severe damage. In the end, they decided to screw it back out, and they did so with such deftness. The only lasting injury was the loss of his eye. He only survived because the drill had actually just pushed on his brain and not gone right through it. As you'll see later in the show, people have survived even that. Although some strange things happened after. Needless to say, brains don't like spikes. Before that, let's talk about possibly the luckiest man in history, or unluckiest depending on how you see it. This is the story of Roy Sullivan, who worked as a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia from the 1930s to the 1980s. In April 1942, he was hiding from a storm in a fire tower. But because the tower had no lightning rod, it kept getting struck. Seeing the place in flames, Sullivan made a run for it, but on his way out, he was struck by lightning, which resulted in some burns, but nothing too severe. Actually, 9 out of 10 people in the US survive a lightning strike, but many of them are left with serious injuries. Suffice to say, you're certainly pushing your luck if you get hit twice or even 3 times. Surely, that can't happen often. In July 1969, Sullivan was hit again, but this time while driving. The force rendered him unconscious, burning his head and setting his hair on fire. His truck kept moving as he was knocked out, and only just stopped by itself when it neared the edge of a cliff. Whew, another lucky strike. A year later, he was hit again, and then 2 years after that, he got hit again. After that, he started to get a little paranoid, thinking his body was somehow attracted to lightning. During the storms, he'd now hide away, far from any place where he could get struck. He went as far to carry a bucket of water around with him in his truck just in case his hair got set on fire again. In 1973, he saw such a storm, and fearing the worst, he drove in the other direction, and it was then that he had this strange feeling because he was sure those darn clouds were following him. That might sound superstitious, but he had every right to be a bit crazy. He was hit again in 1974, and then while he was fishing in 1977, he was struck by lightning for the 7th time. Again, his hair was set on fire. He also suffered burns to his chest and stomach. As if this tale couldn't get any stranger, as he was struggling on the floor half-conscious, a bear came to steal the fish from his fishing line. Sullivan repelled it with a stick. Talk about having a bad day. He's now in the Guinness Book of Records for the person who's been hit by lightning the most times. Statistically, the chances of what happened to him are 4.15 in 100 nonillion. Not only that, how he managed to avoid serious lifelong health complications is a miracle in itself. We should also add to this that statistic is for a normal person, not someone who works outside in a national park. For them, the chance is slightly higher, but 7 strikes in a lifetime is still unbelievable. The Washington Post ran a story about Sullivan and said just that. mentioning a woman that got hit 3 times and ended up with a litany of health conditions including severe neuropathy, chronic pain, digestive problems, aphasia, apraxia, frontal lobe damage, short-term memory loss, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Sullivan certainly had PTSD after his 7 ordeals. As you know, he also had a persecution complex, but who wouldn't? It seems he got depressed as the years went on, and it didn't help that some people crossed the street from him if there was a storm about. Some people thought he was doomed, cursed maybe, but then others saw a more positive angle. He'd survived with few injuries. He once said that he tried to lead a good life, but it seems in his mind that someone or something wanted him dead. Still, he might have thought he was special, once saying, "God spared me for some good purpose. It's between God and me, and nobody but us will ever know." He died in 1983, aged 71. On his gravestone, the epitaph reads, "We loved you, but God loved you more. Amen." You probably think we can't top that, but rest assured, we can. Imagine you worked on the phones at emergency services and you heard these exact words, "I'm cut in two." Those were the words of an American man named Truman Duncan, a man who can say he's literally half the man he used to be. In 2006, he was doing his job as a railroad switchman in Cleburne, Texas when he slipped and fell onto the tracks. He was subsequently dragged under a train. That hurt a bit. He later described the ordeal saying, "It just felt like a monster. I couldn't get away from it. Like it was just pulling me in and I'm pushing away and I was cut in two." He was cut in half. Like really cut in half. Obviously, you can't lose your head and survive, but if you lose the bottom half and if your upper organs are working, well, you can survive. He said he was in shock and he just kept feeling sleepier, but he knew if he allowed himself to drop off, then he'd likely never wake up again. That meant never seeing his wife and kids again, which is what he said kept him alive. He actually told the operator on the phone, "I guess I'm going into shock. Hurry up, ma'am, because I'm about to pass out." When the paramedics arrived on the scene, they could not believe what they were seeing. One of them later recalled, "It didn't seem humanly possible to be cut in half by a rail car and still be alive to survive the injury. We were surprised to find him awake and talking." The massive blood loss should have done him in, but it didn't. He was another medical miracle, with one of the surgeons saying God must have been involved. That surgeon also said more practically, his physiology is remarkable and possibly the weight of the train itself helped keep the pressure on his arteries. Duncan spent hours in surgery as doctors tried their best to get all the dirt out of his wounds and sew him up. For months after, he had at least 23 more surgeries. All kinds of things could have killed him, but he pulled through and these days he gets around in a wheelchair. When asked how he's doing in his new half-life, he said, "Life's good. Goes on, you know?" Alright, the next one sounds like something from a sci-fi movie. When doctors were told what had happened to this guy, they explained that the only thing they could do was to observe his death. The man we're talking about is Anatoly Burgoski, and he's still alive today. On July 13, 1978, he was involved in one of the strangest accidents ever, one that should have killed him. At the time, he was working with the Soviet Union's largest particle accelerator at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino in Russia. He saw that something had malfunctioned on the machine, so he leaned over to see what was up. That was when he put his head right in the way of a 76 giga-electron-volt proton beam. Okay, so that means nothing to you, so let's explain. Suffice it to say, you don't want to be sticking your head in front of a proton beam. That's because the beam that went through his head measured 2,000 to 3,000 gray. A gray is a unit of absorbed dose of ionizing radiation. According to the experts, a whole-body acute exposure to 5 grays or more of high-energy radiation usually leads to death within 14 days. At the time, Burgoski said he didn't feel any pain, but he did see a flash which he described as being brighter than 1,000 suns. His face also started to swell. At first, he didn't tell anyone what happened, but when his face started to feel unusual, he went to see the doctor and he told his bosses what had happened. That's when the doctor said there was no way this man was going to survive. His face started peeling and there was damage to the parts of his head where the beam had gone through, but he surprised everyone by not dying. His brain seemed fine in most respects, and Burgoski carried on working as a physicist while finishing his PhD. Still, he suffered from mysterious fatigue and losing hearing in one ear. He also sometimes had seizures. Later in life, he seemed quite proud that he had unwittingly subjected himself to a daring experiment, once saying, "This is in effect an unintended test of proton warfare. I am being tested. The human capacity for survival is being tested." Now, we think we have to broach the matter of losing your head. We know we told you there is no way you can be decapitated and survive, but that's not strictly true. In 2008, a woman named Stacy Perez was driving her car down a Texas street. The next thing she knew, she woke up to see her skin ripped from her arms and glass everywhere. She'd later been told that a truck had run a red light and hit her at high speed. She wasn't in such a bad way considering the force of the impact, but then she looked into the back seat where her 9-year-old son Jordan was strapped in. He was looking worse for wear. It was as if nothing was holding up his head. She later said, "I remember getting out of the car and looking over at him and seeing how his head had just fallen down." What had in fact happened to him was a decapitation, although it was what was called internal decapitation. His skull had been separated from his spine, so while the injury can't be compared to him losing his head to an axe, it still essentially meant his head was removed from his body, at least in the skeletal way. Importantly though, the nerve fibers that connected to his spine and his brain were still intact. This is not something people generally survive. In fact, out of every 100 cases of internal decapitation, you might have 1 or 2 people that survive. Jordan was one of the lucky ones. Like other people in the show, he was called a medical miracle. The doctor that treated him said, "This was the first patient with this condition that I've seen survive. He not only survived, but in time he was up and about on his feet again, having made a full recovery." Even in cases where folks do pull through this kind of injury, they're very often paralyzed for life. After numerous surgeries and implants, he started to get better quicker than anyone expected. His mom told the media it was like somebody during surgery had given him this medicine that would make him heal quickly, like a superhero or something. As it all happened at the end of the year, his mom said this about his amazing recovery: "This is the best Christmas miracle that I could ever imagine." The next person on the list also survived his accident, but what happened to him after baffled the doctors. This man in time wouldn't just be called a medical miracle, but he would be known as someone who helped advance science. His name was Phineas Gage, and he became known as neuroscience's most famous patient. He had no idea that one day he'd become famous. He was a mere railroad worker. This is where he got hurt. When he was in his 20s, he was what was called a blasting foreman. That meant he was responsible for blasting away chunks of ground before they could carry on building the railway. The operation usually meant making a hole and then packing that hole with dynamite. To ensure it was well packed, they'd often add clay and other things in there. The tool that packed down the clay was called a tamping iron. After that tamping was done, they would stand back and light the fuse. And that's what Gage was doing on the day he had his nasty accident. The date was September 13, 1848. On that day, Gage was looking behind him when the men were working. As he was about to speak, his tamping iron hit the rock, causing a spark. The explosives went off, and that tamping iron set off like a rocket in the direction of Gage's head. And we mean like a rocket. The tool went right through his head and flew off way beyond him. That would kill most men, but Gage took it on the chin, figuratively and literally. One doctor later explained that he was a hardy fella, saying Gage had an iron will as well as an iron frame and a muscular system unusually well developed. His incredible survival, though, is just one part of this tale. Gage was about to blow the minds of scientists. That rocket, like a 13-pound javelin, went up through his jaw, past his cheekbone, behind his left eye, through the left side of his brain, and out the top of his skull. It said it was traveling with such a velocity that it landed some 80 feet away, now covered with blood and bits of brain. That's what you might call an extreme form of lobotomy. Gage suffered convulsions right after the accident. When he could stand up, he threw up with force, so hard that bits of his brain came out of his head. That didn't faze the man, as a doctor would later explain. Mind clear, constant agitation of his legs, being alternately retracted and extended like the shafts of a fulling mill. He says he does not care to see his friends, as he shall be back at work in a few days. When back among the public, some strange things happened. Sometimes he'd just spit out really rude words. Sometimes he'd grab the butts of women, with one doctor remarking that Gage's animal propensities had somehow come alive. His friends said he was capable of uttering the grossest profanity. In short, he'd become like a very drunk Rick from Rick and Morty, or Mel Gibson after a few pints of beer. His personality had completely changed. So he became a medical curiosity, but one that taught doctors how damage to the frontal lobe could have a profound impact on personality. This was new to them back then. Scientists then started theorizing that different parts of the brain had different functions. These days, we know such changes can happen after severe head injuries or when people have had a severe stroke. We now know that the frontal lobes are our executive suite, the bit of brain responsible for keeping us reasonable and making sure we don't do stupid things. Dogs have tiny frontal lobes with relatively few neurons, and that's why they don't blush when they poop on your kitchen floor. Please don't write in the comments that dogs can't blush, we know. Gage died in his mid-30s due to complications of all the seizures he was having. Now you need to watch this mind-blowing survival story. Crazy story of woman who survives live grenade lodged in her face.